I am speaking to Eugene Anderson, or Gene Anderson, who is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of California, Riverside. We're talking about his paper, China Among Others, Mutual Shaping of Foodways in Eastern Asia. Thank you, Jean, for joining us. And thank you so much for the fascinating paper. It was excellent. So I'm really keen to sort of get stuck in with the first question, if I may, which is, what is the central question that you address in your paper?
The central question that I was addressing? Yeah, basically that China was part of an entire world system of all of East Asia, and then connecting by the Silk Road on what is now being called the Maritime Silk Road through the Indian Ocean with the rest of the world, and was not isolated and not unique, and got a tremendous amount of influences from outside, especially from Western Asia over time, quite a lot from South and Southeast Asia also. So sort of trying to put China in a context with all the other realms of it connected with.
It's fascinating. You know, you describe in this paper at the beginning, you describe the sort of East Asian world system that then generally gets interacts with Near East Asia, and sort of it sort of expands through. And maybe I'm maybe summarizing this wrong, but through a sort of domination, not necessarily conquering. You know, there is obviously a world system theory based on, you know, colonialism, where, you know, a lot of expansion happened through guns and warfare. But this was very much a case of trade, maybe borrowing, mutual influencing. Could you expand a little bit more about that?
Well, the East Asian world system begins with China. You know, it begins with the development of something like civilization in China 4,000 years ago. And you had what appears to be a tiny little state forming in the Central Yellow River area. And there are several other quite large communities and sophisticated polities contemporary with that. We don't know whether they were states or not. Anyway, you've got a gradual expansion of civilization through contacts and borrowing literacy and borrowing bronze making technology and so on by all these other groups. And the East Asian world system expands to eventually include Korea, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands and so forth, and southward Vietnam, and then it starts merging into Southeast Asia, so it all becomes part of one giant world system by 1700 or so. But meanwhile, you have this huge contact across Central Asia, which started much earlier with especially with Indo-European expansion into what is now Western China, and that's pretty early, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And then the development of what got to be called the Silk Road, although it was neither one road nor was silk the only thing that was carried, of course. And you have a lot of roads across the steppes and deserts. And China expanded, you had this great critical battle on the otherwise completely insignificant Talas River in 751, when China came up against the Islamic world, the expanding Arabs, or by then it was an Arab-Persian world. And the border was pretty much stabilized. It's pretty much the same border that you have now between Xinjiang and the former Soviet republics in Central Asia. You have the very, very high Altai Mountains, which are pretty difficult to cross. And it's awfully easy to expand through the level areas of Central Asia eastward to that. And it was fairly easy, though not as easy, for China to expand westward through Central Asia. And so they met up, and you've got a border forming, which then remained fairly stable between Chinese civilization and Western civilization. But it was, of course, pretty porous, and the Western world expanded when China was weak. And Central Asia, of course, had its own players, Turkic and Mongol groups that took over the whole area, and the Mongols managed to take over most of the world for a while. Anyway, the result of this was just a tremendous amount of exchange of foodways. So my lifelong coworker, Paul Juno, and I have done a lot of work on what foodways expanded. We've wandered around odd parts of Central Asia, kind of looking into what people were eating on the ground there. And that's pretty fascinating. See how very early a lot of the current food boundaries were formed, but how they're constantly borrowing back and forth.
The sort of ethnoarchaeology that you've done with Paul, you've obviously that forms a basis of some of the discussion in the paper, but then you also draw on a few key texts. So you take the sort of Han Ming period, this quite long durée, and then you take sort of several texts to kind of look into it in a deeper way. For example, the Yinshan Zhengyao, and of course you have experience with that text, very much experience with that, a lot of experience with that text. And then the Hui Hui Yaofang, and also some writings by Gao Lian. I just wondered what made you choose those particular texts. Obviously, I can understand why you chose the first text. As I said, you have a lot of experience with that particular text. But the others, was there a...
Well, basically people chose those first texts. The Bianshan Zhengyao was kind of a natural thing to pick out, because if there's one most important text to show the borrowing across from Central Asia into China, that is it. It's this amazing, well, it was the court nutrition manual by the head nutritionist for the Mongol court. Mm. So he's kind of synthesizing Mongol and Western and Chinese nutritional science and advice. And at that time, you have to remember that Central Asia was the scientific, medical, and nutritional center of the world. Maybe not quite by that time, but it had been somewhat earlier, because the greatest medical authorities of the Middle Ages were people like Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, who were working in what is now Uzbekistan in the 1000s, 1100s. By the 1300s, when the Yinshan Zhengyao and the Hui Hui Yaofang come out, Central Asia had declined because the Mongols had kind of killed a lot of people, but it was still a major center of medical and nutritional knowledge. And so if you wanted to be kind of cool and know what to do to cure people, that's where you went. So you have, the Yinshan Zhengyao was natural. Then Paul got kind of crazy and decided to translate the entire Hui Hui Yaofang, which is an appalling piece of work. 500 pages of very, very difficult medical Chinese, mixed up with, Persian and Arabic, and he could handle that. I just do the biological stuff, and I can sort of vet some of the translation, but mostly I handle the biological side of it. Gao Lian was quite a different thing. I forget just how I discovered Gao Lian, but then I was working with a grad student, Su Meiyu, who's now professor of history back in China. I kind of lost touch with her, but anyway, she was a grad student at the University of Washington at the time. We just decided it would be a lot of fun to translate Gao Lian. It was cool. It's a fascinating guy, because he has all this wild-eye nutritional advance from the late Ming Dynasty, but it's full of Central Asian recipes, especially for the sweets. So we had a lot of fun translating the sweets.
Yes, I mean the brilliance that you actually included five recipes for various sweets in your paper, which sound marvelous, sound so delicious. It's hard to see the nutritional value of it, rather than as you mentioned, he looks like he was putting these recipes together for pleasure.
Yeah, Gao Lian was very much into trying to get people to be better nourished, but he also liked good food, and he obviously liked sweets a tremendous amount, because there's all this stuff. And there's this wonderful recipe for halwa, and he transliterated it as halwa, which means sea radish, but obviously it's halwa. Sea radish doesn't make any sense, especially for what is very obviously a typical Near Eastern halwa recipe. That was pretty funny. Some of the transliterations are a lot more difficult. We never did figure out exactly what Shirlire were.
Well, I mean, the recipes themselves, I absolutely support your thesis. You can see just in terms of the list of ingredients that you introduce in some of the recipes that form the central bulk of your paper. Fascinating. I just wanted to focus in on some of the interesting details from Yinshan Zhengyao. You include a recipe for a lamb meatball, which has so many, such a rich riot of ingredients from Central Asia and China proper. I wondered what you thought of it when you were transcribing these kinds of recipes, and obviously it spoke to a kind of fusion, and you yourself mentioned that actually some of these kind of combinations don't survive this period. You don't really see this kind of cuisine again. So what do you make of that in terms of taste or nutritional value? Or
it's a fusion cuisine. I mean, we're not the first people in the history of the world to invent fusion cuisines. And you have a lot of this. There's the GGP and Shirley, which is another slightly earlier food book from, well, it's more than a food book, but it's got a bunch of recipes in it from the Mongol period. It's got some of these same crazy recipes. Mix, kind of combining everything exotic from both Chinese and Western Asian cuisine. This must have, the Mongols must have really been quite fascinated with this because, I mean, Mongol cuisine, even today, is sort of like flour and meat and dairy products. And in Genghis Khan's time, it was really simple. So here they get to the court and, here's a recipe with 40 ingredients. Wow.
Yeah, it was brilliant. I mean, the ingredients that you list in the paper, ureale seeds, pine nuts, almonds, mushrooms, apricot kernel paste, walnuts, pistachios, safflower, gardenia fruit, vegetable oil, ginger, bean paste, Chinese yams, eggs, onions, vinegar, 5-spice soy sauce, and coriander. Well, how pungent it would have been to eat that particular meatball.
It actually turns out to be wonderful. It fell to my lot to kitchen test all this stuff because, Bill was doing most of the translating stuff like that. So anyway, I kitchen tasted these, and that turned out to be a very, very good recipe. It really tastes wonderful. And I did everything down to cooking a goat. There's a recipe for that in there, so I did it. The only thing about the only recipes I didn't test were the ones for lungs because I couldn't get any sheep lungs. California markets don't have everything. Almost, yeah.
You mentioned something quite interesting in the appendix. You talk about Hu Hui being quite derivative. By the time he was writing these prescriptions, these sort of medicinal recipes, he was actually quite derivative, and some of the ideas sprung from from earlier writings. And you pick out Sun Miao particularly as somebody who sort of pioneered some of these kind of mixture of ideas or borrowings from Near East Asia. I wondered if you could just quickly expand on that as well. Did you find that so there was a kind of body of knowledge that was transmitted over the ages, or did people sort of how did that derivation come about?
I doubt if Sun Miao was all that innovative. He's part of his time. There's a lot of borrowing from the Western world by then, which unfortunately is poorly documented. The stuff doesn't survive. There was an entire Hu Bansao, Iranian or Islamic herbal, depending on what Hu meant at the time. And of course, it's lost. It must have been just utterly fascinating. I wish we had it. Sun Miao mentions about 8 or so foreign foods, which he gives the values for in Chinese medicine, and how much influence Western medicine had had on Chinese medicine by then is still somewhat unclear. There'd been a little bit. They knew about Galenic medicine that got across real early. There was even a guy calling himself Galen at the Tibetan court at about that time, in the 800s and 700s, 800s, and then of course the Galenic influence rose through the Mongol period and then declined rapidly after that as Central Asia kind of lost out on medical leadership, and Chinese medicine developed rapidly apace. But the degree to which these things fuse, I was rather amazed to discover when we were working on the Huihui Yaofang that they've got a whole section on stroke. Fortunately, one of the sections that survives on the Huihui Yaofang is an entire section on stroke, which is fortunately unmistakable in medical, even in Chinese medical terms of the Middle Ages, because you got half of your body paralyzed or half your face paralyzed, and the other half is okay, and there's only one thing that does that. So you're dealing with one thing. And it turns out that kind of the main featured formulae for treating it in the Huihui Yaofang are essentially exactly the same as contemporary formulae that we have from Egypt and France. There's a surviving document in the Cairo Janissa that has the same formula, the same treatment, a bunch of herbs for treating. And then there's a Jewish doctor named Isaac Todros in France at the time, the 1300s. There's the same formula, plus lavender and a couple of other things that you can't get in China. And so this really is one medical tradition.
Mm.
It's just astonishing.
Wow.
And you have the same medical values attached to stuff in the Wei Yafan that you get in Western sources, even right up till now. Let alone, and of course, they're mostly coming off Ibn Sina and Al-Biruni and people like that. But it's a pretty common knowledge. There's a lot of documentation. We're coming out with a full edition of the Wei Yafan where you'll see all of this stuff.
That's amazing. Well, you've already touched on this kind of scholarship that your paper is broadly situated within. The people that you mentioned, also in the paper you mentioned Roderick Patak and Deanna Knapp, and of course, Schaefer's chapter in Casey Chang's original book talks a lot about this kind of borrowing via the land Silk Roads. So I wondered, and world systems theory, you're obviously interacting with that a little bit as well, and so I wondered, how does this sit within that broader scholarship? What kinds of connections are you drawing in, and what kinds of new arguments might you be presenting with this paper?
Well, world systems theory in this case, I'm mainly drawing on just to show that there is a world system, that there are a couple of world systems here, because they've got the Western one and the Chinese one, and they're interfacing. The main thing I'm drawing world system theory for in this case is just to talk. It's a very good way to talk about connections and the fact that you're not looking at isolated regimes that are occasionally reaching out to each other. You're talking about a highly systematized thing where people are interacting all the time. There's a lot more to world systems theory than that, and I'm not drawing on the other stuff, although I could.
You also mentioned Miranda Brown, who is a co-panelist in this in your panel. Talking well, she's got a brilliant paper on dairy, and she also, which struck me as quite interesting, you mentioned that especially for Hu Suhui and his writings, North China, Central Asia seem to be one complicated, very complex, possibly fragmented, but sort of quite connected in its foodway. And she also mentions very similar things, as and talks a lot about North China as a concept. Kind of, it's sort of in her understandings of dairy and her kind of exploration of dairy and where it's located. North China itself seems like a very shifting concept. And I wondered, did you also find that this idea of Central Asia, North China was quite slippery, and it's difficult to really sort of pin down in terms of its kind of its cultural place vis-a-vis the Chinese heartland, or whatever you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Here again, world systems theory is useful. China, of course, was my paper title, China among others, is ripped off more or less from China among equals, that edited volume by Morris Rosaby and the gang on China in the pre-Mongol period, when there were several equally powerful groups there. And there's now especially lots of really cool scholarship on the period between 220 and 580, 581, when China was divided, and North China was divided into a whole bunch of states, and North and South China were separate, and really seemed to be very separate realms and separate civilizations. And there was a lot of sassing back and forth with some classic sources, which I've always enjoyed, where the Northerners are sassing the South Chinese the same way that the English used to sass the French. You guys don't eat real meat, you eat fish and frogs. And the Southerners are saying, well, yeah, you guys eat mutton, which stinks, and yogurt, which is disgusting. And it's really hilarious stuff to read, especially if you read 19th century insults between French and English. And, people really have, the same stupid low form of humor just goes on and on and on. And but anyway, the important thing is that you have several different ethnic groups and several different civilizations or cultures interacting in China in the 200 through the 500s period. And it's really interesting. I would love to know more about that. And we are finding more. There's all this archaeological work that's coming out, being summarized by people like Albert Dien, and there's a new book which I have not yet gotten my hands on the Gen Con Empire, as he calls it, uh, which is supposed to be talking about this and finally looking at that period as a really exciting, innovative period, which of course it was. And it was a period when there was a tremendous amount of borrowing from Central Asia. And you've got these Central Asian derived groups like the Shenbei. The Shenbei language has now been deciphered and it turns out to be basically ancestral to or closely related to the Khitan language. They're both distantly related to Mongol, but in the Mongol family, which is interesting because people didn't know that until a couple of years ago. There's a lot of reformulation of these linguistic ties.
Right. Wow. Well, it seems like sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, you've got food, all these dairy foods coming in that Miranda talks about, and various other kinds of foods. This is probably the period when you got a lot of this. Well, I guess a little earlier, maybe you got a lot of this borrowing of wheat and flour technology from the Middle East and Central Asia that gives you mantou and jiaozi and things like that now.
You end the paper with a provocative note, a brilliantly articulated one, where you situate the Colombian, the kind of colonial European colonial project as very much a kind of, it had its, it was very different kind of borrowing, very much an intellectual robbing in some cases, as you rightly say, but then obviously your note of optimism about borrowing much more, actually, borrowing rather than intellectual robbery, obviously, for very immediate concerns that we have about making sure that our food system is sustainable and things like that. I wondered if you had anything more to say to bring this to a close.
Well, just that people borrow and cultures are not closed and civilizations are not closed, and it's natural for people to pick up any interesting idea that's around. One of the things that I have expended a great deal of thinking about is how Galenic medicine spread all over the world the way it did. This is something my graduate advisor, George Foster, got me excited about. He was always wondering how it was that Hippocratic Galenic medicine prevailed so much in Latin America and other areas. And it's partly because there were similar local traditions, because everybody understands that if you're too hot or too cold, there's something wrong with you. But the entire Galenic humoral tradition just spread so widely that as of the 19th century, it was clearly the most widely believed thought system or cognitive system in the world. Way outpaced any religion or political ideology in terms of the number of people that were living by it. And it fused with Chinese medicine pretty easily because ideas of heating and cooling were pretty similar to yang and yin. A lot of the ideas were adaptable, and it's impossible to tease out who got what from which tradition in the Huihue Yaofan. It's all much done. So I guess the great moral to this is that if cultural appropriation is such a bad thing, well, people have been doing bad things for a long time because every culture has appropriated everything good that it could get its hands on, basically. And we're probably not going to stop that. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, there's reasons to think cultural appropriation is a bad thing under many circumstances. Certainly, if you're taking something without paying for it when people deserve to be paid for it. But on the other hand, we need to borrow and learn from each other.
Fantastic, Jean. That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for talking to us about your paper today, and we'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very, very much. Glad to do it.